Hello there, guys. How you all doing? And welcome to, I guess, less than 2 weeks to go until the general election, because that's still happening. Are any of you feeling like the campaign's been, we've got to that difficult middle bit where the initial excitement has died down, the first few televised debates had happened, the manifestos came out, and now it feels just like we've got a little bit of a slog to the end. I mean, there's still things to keep track of. Maybe the polls might continue to move ever so slightly. Maybe there'll be more gaffes or scandals within the next week or two. God knows the precedent set by the campaign so far suggests that much. Um, I remember when Sunak left D-Day early, thinking, "Oh wow, you couldn't make it up. How could things get any worse?" Blah blah blah. And then this whole Tory betting thing. It's different in the nature of the D-Day thing. Obviously, the D-Day thing was very much a decision made by Rishi Sunak, and it was arguably it was an optics thing, but lots of people were also quite upset at him about it. But with the betting thing, and let me preface this by saying I'm not for a moment suggesting that Rishi Sunak is running a secret sweepstakes cabal in Downing Street where they all got together before he called the election and went, aha, right, everyone quick, nip down to Ladbrokes and put this much money on this date and we'll all make off with a nice tidy profit when all is said and done. I imagine, I could be wrong. There's still lots of details we don't know, but I imagine this was just a handful of individuals who felt that they had some insider information on what was going on, going, "Oh yeah, I'll put a little bet down. Why not? No one else sees the summer election coming, but I've got a feeling Rishi's going to go for it." Which has obviously turned out to be a very stupid thing to do. But we're not really any strangers to people at the top of government or around those in power doing very stupid things and not thinking about the consequences of how it's going to look. So, yeah, this one I don't think Rishi is to blame personally for. Although, I think the problem is that there have been calls for him to suspend the candidates who are being investigated, and he's kind of immediately climbed behind that wall of saying, "Ah, well, there's an ongoing investigation, so I'm not going to comment on any of those things at this time." Yada yada yada. Which, you know, it looks a lot more decisive, I think, if you do suspend the candidates. Of course, if you do that, then you end up with a replica of that by-election the other month situation where you've got an official candidate in place who's going to be on the ballot, but the party has officially unendorsed them for the time being, which complicates matters a little bit. But Lee Hallam sums it up quite nicely in the chat here, who says, "Stupid advisors who think no one is looking." Yeah, that seems to be the pattern of a lot of things that we've seen over the past few weeks and months. It's just decisions being made that to me, and I imagine to you, you look at it and you think, why? How have they decided to do that? Did they think no one would have thoughts or feelings about it? Did they not think about the reaction to it, etc.? But this just seems to be happening um, time and time again. So that's the latest chapter in the Tories' absolutely awful election they've been having recently. And I imagine that's going to continue rolling on for a little while. But there's unless there's new information revealed, i.e., the name is revealed of an MP or a cabinet minister or something who made a bet, or the police announced they're investigating even more people than they were before, or whatever. I think this story will continue to linger a bit, and it will have done its damage. But it probably doesn't have much further to progress within this election, at the very least. Other interesting things. Nigel Farage has, I think, by all accounts, people would say, had a very good election so far since throwing his hat in the ring and reform surging in the polls. It looks like he might have made his first major misstep in this, which was within an interview saying that the Western NATO held responsibility for Russia invading Ukraine. And there's been a lot of backlash against that, as you can probably imagine. And when you think about I guess what you'd call the settled foreign policy view amongst most of the public and the country, and indeed most of the politicians of the major parties as well, which is, here's Ukraine, a sovereign nation, and we quite like the idea of our fellow nations and allies having sovereignty. This is a country that they perform in the Eurovision Song Contest with us. They've they're in our neck of the woods, albeit off on the borders between Russia and the rest of Europe. and they've been in a massive invasion by their neighbor, and of course Russia will use justifications and saying, well, we don't like the fact that they were maybe looking at joining the EU or joining NATO, or we don't want that on our backyard, etc. But then again, it's very easy as well for Putin to go, well, I don't think Ukraine's a real country in the first place anyway, so actually we're entitled to take whatever we want from it, regardless. Hey ho, feels a bit more pretexty to me. So I think that that unfortunately for old Nigel, sort of I wouldn't say lets the mask slip, although maybe I would, because it's not as if this isn't stuff that he said in the past anyway. But I feel that in this election campaign, at least, he's avoided saying anything too controversial, unless it's the sort of controversial thing that will, rile up his supporters, and they'll be very pleased with the stuff that he said. Other people find it controversial, but the potential reform voters will like it. Perhaps this is the difference. Perhaps this is the first thing that he's said where actually you'll get a majority of maybe a majority of even those thinking of voting reform going, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about that, Nige. Lee Hallam says this is something he said previously rather than unforced error. He was dealing with the comment. Oh, really? So this wasn't something that he'd let slip in a recent interview. This is a comment he'd made from some time ago that they've since been responding to, is it? Okay, well, that makes a slight difference then. I'll give Nigel a couple of extra points for not stating that as his view within the election campaign. Well done, Nigel. So we've got to the point where we're now going, right, Mr. Farage, we're now going to have a look at some of the things that you've said during your lengthy time in the public eye. We can start assessing some of these. It's probably good, to be honest. He's had a pretty easy ride of it the last few weeks. But fair enough, fair clarification to be made if it's being asked about previous comments rather than something in a recent interview. A few more comments. What do we have here? Maximilian Robespierre says, hi there. Charlie Simmons says there are rumours more people will be named in the scandal, apparently. Lee also adds, it's an insular world. The Tory candidate is married to the campaign coordinator. She is up against his ex-wife for the Greens. Lee Hallam says it came up in the interview. He was asked about it. So they right. So just so I can be absolutely clear on this, so there was an interview that took place. He was asked, "What is your view on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?" And he answered the question. And is that within the time of this election campaign, within the past week or so? This is him recently saying this is what I think about the matter, rather than him defending some older comment. Just so I'm absolutely clear on it. In the meantime, Ed Davey's still about doing his thing. I think Ed Davey gave a pretty good performance at the there was a leaders event on BBC Question Time. You had Davey, Sweeney, Sunak, and Starmer, and I think of the lot of them, I probably liked Ed Davies the most. He was still doing a bit of the old, I'm a standard politician giving standard politician answers and all the rest of it, but there was a degree of being a little bit more personable and human seeming than the rest of them. So that was all right. I think Starmer gave a sort of a so-so performance, a sort of typical middle of the road Starmer type performance. John Sweeney, I was kind of impressed by a little bit, but then I realised that maybe because I'm not so used to seeing him, I just hadn't fully tapped into what his own political cadence was, if that makes sense. After I was going, oh, Sweeney's pretty good at this stuff, and then at one point he kind of shut himself down by point blank refusing to answer a question, just saying, I want to campaign to get the most SNP MPs elected in this election. And then he was asked the question again. He goes, I want to campaign to get as many SNP MPs elected in this election. And then they go, you've not answered the question, John Sweeney. Well, let me tell you, I want to campaign to get as many SNP MPs elected in this election. So yeah, of that bunch, I'll say that Davey had the best night. Sunak, poor guy, in inverted quotes. He but by the way, Lee Hallam says it was a panorama. He was asked about the earlier comment. Okay, thank you for that. That took me far too long, I think, to clarify. This is the trouble in a way. I've been watching all this election stuff, and I'm still missing bits, initial things that come up, interviews or programs or whatever, and I'm hearing about them after the fact, even though I feel as if I'm staying fairly well plugged in because I'm watching most of the stuff that I see, but apparently not all. But yeah, Sunak, he came across as sort of a bit of his tetchy self, didn't he? Where you got the distinct impression once or twice that, you know, if it weren't for these silly thickos in the audience who just aren't getting what he has to say, the world would be a much better place. If only these, you know, if only these darn mouth breathers in the Question Time audience could just get on Sunak's level, then, you know, it would be a home run. But they're just they don't seem to understand the points Mr. Sunak is putting across, and Mr. Sunak doesn't really have time for that. Although he won't frown at you, he will still smile. It'll just be a rather angry, frustrated smile that he offers you instead. Charlie Simmons says Davey was definitely the best. Sunak was dire. He looks like he wanted to die. So I think also BBC Question Time is having similar little interviews with audience bits for Nigel Farage, one or both, or whoever the Green Party leaders are these days, and I think Plaid Cymru as well, for that matter. I don't know whether this was always in the offing or whether it's been tacked on since the controversy about, well, hang on, why wasn't Reform invited to the four-way thing where you can only vote for the SNP in one country, but in some polls, Reform's ahead of the Tories, blah, blah, blah. But they're giving everyone a little look in there. Lee Hallam says, to be fair, he has cause to feel tetchy. He pulls all the levers, but they aren't connected. And Sam Blake adds, Swiss me, daddy. Oh, these are some wonderful comments we're getting today. It was tacked on, says Lee Hallam. Yes, it felt like it, to be honest. It felt like it from them kind of going, oh yeah, it might be seen as a bit of a stitch up if we're not inviting Reform. I guess we'll have to do that down the line anyway. So looking at the wider picture for this election, all kinds of polling to be able to be looking at right now. I've seen a few constituency polls. Now, you know, I'm not taking them as a given that what a certain constituency poll says is what's going to end up being the case. But I've seen a constituency poll that has the Greens looking pretty darn healthy in one of the seats they're going for. Now, whether or not this is a constituency poll that might have been commissioned by the Greens, you never know. But I think that the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, Reform, but basically, if you're a smaller party, you're going to have a good time in this election. The discussion has very much moved on to where we've been saying it was at before. Sorry, let me start that again. I don't think I'm being as coherent as I should be. The discussion about the results of this election for the Tories very much just seems to be now whether it's a 93 Canada style complete rout where they get obliterated, or in a better case scenario, you end up with kind of how bad the Tories did in a 97 Blair landslide scenario. That, you know, the topic of debate, I feel, seems to be sort of on that borderline of, will the Tories will they manage to get over 100 seats, or will they end up with under 100 seats? That kind of seems to be where we are with things right now. But it's very hard to predict some of these things simply because in first past the post, just a couple percentage points in national vote share can make a real difference in a number of different seats, especially when you've got seats with much greater amounts of localized support than you would elsewhere. So for parties like the Greens and Reform, who obviously you're not expecting to do that well countrywide in terms of how many seats they'll get, you know, what one or 2 points in the polls for them nationally could mean a massive swelling of support in sort of a dozen or so seats where they stand a good chance demographically of getting in. Lee Hallam says that the polls about the Greens, saying that the Greens will win those seats, says both were commissioned by the Green Party, and adds that Aaron Banks paid for Clacton. And I had also seen that poll that had Reform on, I don't know, like nearly 50-odd% in Clacton. And I went, oh, whoa, Reform's looking pretty good at the moment. Interesting, I see. So that the polls that have the Greens winning some seats were commissioned by the Greens, and the polls that have Reform winning Clacton was commissioned by long-standing Nigel Farage friend Aaron Banks. Cameron says, hello, Captain. Have you seen the recent poll for Yorkshire and Humber? I don't think I've seen the recent poll for Yorkshire and Humber. I've seen, a few different breakdowns here and there of different regions of the UK. I've seen one for Wales. I've seen a couple for Wales that have had Labour's still ahead, obviously, by a very good margin, but Reform seem to have overtaken the Tories. Let me see if I can find Yorkshire and the Humber. Would this would Election Maps UK have shared this recently if it's come out? Hang on, I'll tell you what. Just while I'm doing this, I might as well screen share so you guys can see what I can see. There we go. Right then. So what have we got? Clacton constituency. There we are. Reform 48%. Conservatives down 51 points if the poll is to be believed on 21. What else do we have here? Westminster voting intention. We've got another one here that's got Reform ahead of the Tories. In all fairness, that's not the most common thing. We seem to be getting like a small handful that have Reform ahead, maybe another little handful that got them roughly level pegging, maybe another little handful that have got Conservatives slightly ahead, and then maybe another little handful that have got the Tories a decent bit further ahead of Reform. Westminster voting intention. Look, there we are. Yeah, look, that's the contrast for you, I suppose. Here's one poll that has Reform on 20% and the Tories on 19%. Here's another as Conservatives on 22% and Reform on 13%. So I think actually that quite nicely describes, I think, the range that you've got with that. Actually, no, there was one really strange standout poll I saw on the Wikipedia table. Remind me of that, and I'll show you it in a little bit. The East of England region is projected to have MPs from 5 different parties after the next election. The last time this happened was in Northern Ireland in the 1997 election. We've got some Westminster voting intention, North Herefordshire, Waveney. Oh, these are the Green ones. Yep. These are the Green Commission polls that have the Greens winning. I'm not seeing anything here on Yorkshire and the Humber, I'm afraid, Cam. Bear with, let's do a few more comments here. Could this finally be the election where all sides of the political... Lee Ball says, could this finally be the election where all sides of the political spectrum unite against first past the post in the aftermath? Hope so. I mean... I think it comes back to the same old issue with first past the post, which is that it favors those who are already big and established and punishes those who aren't. Labour, as much as the Labour members would like first past the post gone, I don't think the party leadership would go for it. The Tories is a really interesting one, actually, because if the Tories truly, if the scenario comes to pass where the Tories actually are smashed into oblivion and end up with something ridiculous like a dozen or less MPs at the end of the election. I don't think that's the most likely outcome, by the way, but say if that were the case, at that point, the Tories might have to start going, oh, hang on, we're now on the sharp end of the stick as far as the first past the post system goes. But I think it would really have to be a scenario like that would get the Tories to countenance the idea of voting Reform if it started to benefit them electorally. If there's any sliver, I think, of Labour or the Tories still being favoured by first past the post, then I think it'll only ever be the smaller parties backing Reform to it. The MRP polls are the big losers in this election. They are all over the place compared with 2019. The question then, I suppose, will be, when all is said and done at the end of this election, will we be able to point to a particular pollster that's had their MRPs more on the ball than the others? Because I agree there has been a very big spread of them. But would we be able to zero in on someone who's maybe got it a bit more accurate than the rest of them? Heath Starmer says we are 20% ahead of the Tories in Gotham City. Lee Hallam says on average polling for the last few days is Tory and Reform level. And on Yorkshire and the Humber, Cameron Hickman says Labour 35%, Reform 26%. Wow. Conservatives 18%, Lib Dems 11%, Greens 9% for the Yorkshire and Humber poll. Thank you for that. I'll tell you what. Here's an idea. Let's go on the Wikipedia page for the polling, and indeed anything that's been brought out sort of regionally might be broken down in certain areas as well. All right then. So what have we got here? Here's our lovely little graph, and the lines have been updated. Look at these lines. Look at this practical convergence that you have here, very, very nearly. And the lines are usually a week or so behind what the actual polls are saying. So you could have that point of crossover here. The little dots indicate individual polls. So interestingly enough, you can see that Labour, even though their line is down, but still pretty high and level with where it's been for well over the past 2 or 3 years. Individual polls here and there have been having them falling below that 40% mark. So let me have a look on here. There was one poll that was a really strange reversal of the other stuff that I'd seen that I thought was worth mentioning. This was one by People Polling. Now tell me if this is a mistype, guys, or whether you saw this as well, or whether someone's just entered this in wrong in the Wikipedia article. This People Polling poll from I don't know, less than a week ago, has the Conservatives on 15% and Reform on 24%, which is pretty incredible. That seems like the ultimate outlier of outliers. Maybe a couple of weeks ago, the one that had Reform ahead of the Tories seemed a bit like a potential outlier, but now actually, broadly speaking, they're within a handful of points of each other. But my goodness, a poll that puts the Tories on 15% and Reform on 24%. Well, look, if you wanted your scenario where, I don't know, the Lib Dems really do beat the Tories into third place at the end of this election, then polling numbers like that being reflected is probably the way to do it. But it's a total mismatch from pretty much everything else that we're seeing from the other pollsters here. By and large, Tories are on or just under about 20% of the vote, and Reform are somewhere in the high teens. That seems to be the way of it. And Labour's hovering just over 40-odd% as well. Lee Hannum says it's not a mistype. Charlie Simmons says, look who commissioned that poll, though, Swiss. It's from GB News. Oh, is it from GB? Oh, it is from GB News. I see. So you're telling me that when a poll is commissioned by the Green Party to see if they can win a seat in the election, it shows they'll win a seat in the election. And when a poll is commissioned by Aaron Banks to see whether Reform will do well in Clacton, it shows that Reform will do well in Clacton. And when a poll is commissioned by GB News, it just so happens to be the complete outlier poll that shows Reform being miles ahead of the Tories compared to everything else. Sam Blake says, I have swelling support for Nige. And Heath Starmer says, polling is commissioned to influence and shape public opinion, not to measure it. Yes, crack that and it all makes sense, Mr. Hitchens. Okay, then. So what I was going to do was see if we could break it down into individual areas here, just off the back of Yorkshire and the Humber. Okay, so here we have in Wales. Interesting picture in Wales here. That you've had Reform surging up past Plaid, pretty much overtaking the Conservatives as well, near enough. Not quite there, actually. The most recent poll that we've got has Reform and the Conservatives level pegging in Wales. The ones from a little bit earlier in the year obviously do not, but that's the direction of travel there. You're going to see that as the direction of travel everywhere, basically. Reform coming up to challenge the Tories. We've got some individual seats here. We've got a couple for Clacton here. JL Partners and Salvation. What do these respective two Clacton ones say? Okay. All of the two ones here from June onwards. They've got Reform leading in both of those there. Lee Hallam says there is a new young voters poll on there. A young voters poll. Interesting. Yeah, we've got our one for the Greens there as well. Red Wall polling, that's from 21. That's from 23. Yep, Labour winning solidly there. You go Blue Wall, JR Partners, blah 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 blah. Other geographical samples. Yeah, give me just a minute. I'm just having a little look through this. Liebel adds Welsh Labour leader not popular at present, not quite a Humza meltdown, but a steady slide. What happened with him? Was it that he got elected because obviously Mark Drakeford went and the other guy got in, but he had some questions around him of something to do with donations to do with energy companies or something that was a bit dodgy or appeared a bit dodgy, and sort of questions about that have been plaguing him ever since he got in. So is that perhaps taking the shine off of Wales in Labour more so than it may have been otherwise? Private. Oh yes, I see what you mean. Okay, we've got Muslim voters, private renter voters, young voters. Muslim voters, Labour's. Yep, Labour's pretty solidly ahead there. Most recently in May, though, 63%. Private renter voters, yep, Labour having a good time over the rest of them there. Young voters, interesting, young voters. So amongst young voters, and this is from earlier in June from Savanta, we have Labour on just over 50%, the Tories on 11%, Lib Dems on 12%. Greens on 10. Oh, it's very nicely distributed amongst the other non-Labour parties. 12%. Reform on 7% and others on 5% there. But you've got for I don't know what count as young voters. Age 18 to 25. It says there, or 18 to 24. Yeah, so if you're a young voter, you're probably just as likely to vote Green or Lib Dem as you are to vote Tory in this election, it would seem. Lee Hallam says he took money for his campaign from a dodgy company. I see. Yeah, so he's not having a good time of it, is he? I'm trying to think what I was driving at here when I was looking up all the polls. It was just to see the breakdown in different areas, wasn't it? But yeah, that's what I think is going to be so interesting about this election in a way, because from day one it was obviously writing was on the wall. Labour's going to win it, Tories are going to lose it, etc. And then there was a little bit of, there is a bit of intrigue about just how far the Tories are going to fall. Reform comes into the equation, and suddenly everything's very much up in the air because their vote siphoning off of primarily the Tories could damage the Tories and even more seats versus Labour. But I'm really interested to see when that first past the post threshold is crossed, whatever number it ends up being, when suddenly where you previously would have been advantaged by being a party such as the Tories or Labour and being able to win a large number of seats off of proportionately a lower national vote share, versus being a party like, I don't know, Reform or the Lib Dems or whoever, where you get an amount of the national vote share, 10 or 15% of the national vote share, but the total number of seats you get doesn't really tend to reflect that crossover point between being aided and being harmed by the voting system. I think the Tories are they could well feel the sharp end of that, and that's going to be really interesting, because and I'm interested as well to see things like on the tactical voting front. Obviously, it does seem that in areas where people are trying to get the Tories out, support seems to be coalescing around those, the best placed person to get the Tories out. But then in other areas where it's sort of safer for the incumbent non-Tory party, whether or not the tactical voting goes the other way almost, then you kind of go, oh well, it's a safe bet the Tories aren't winning in this seat. I can just vote however I want to in this particular case. The makeup of the next parliament's going to be so interesting. And indeed, which Tory ministers end up losing their seats. I saw one particular projection the other day that even said that Rishi Sunak was going to lose his seat. And I'd put out a tweet a week or two ago, kind of as a half joke, in the wake of the D-Day thing, saying the biggest Portillo moment of the election is Rishi Sunak himself loses his seat. And he's defending a decent enough majority, but I can only speak for myself. I wouldn't vote for Sunak in his constituency. Then again, I'm not the prime Tory voting type, really, am I? But that would just be the great big ribbon on top of this present of a general election if, when all is said and done, Sunak loses his own seat as well. Lee Ball says, just can't wait for 10 p.m. On the 4th of July. Going to be hilarious, however it sways from here. Lee Ball also adds, this is the big banter timeline. Lee Hallam, I've got both the Lees in today, say, I think Rishi might be hoping to lose it, then his nightmare is over. Well, very true. Very true. If you lose your seat, at least then it's clear cut. At least then you're dislodged from everything. It's no longer a matter of, well, you're still the leader of the Tories. Do you resign immediately upon losing the election, or do you stay on for a little while? Or no, doesn't need to make any of those considerations. If he loses his seat, that's fine. And then he can go off and live in California or wherever it might be, without even accusations of, you jumped straight out of Parliament the moment you lost the election, because he won't be in Parliament anyway. If he doesn't win the seat, there's no longer some thing he's got to deliberate about. I wonder if I should stay on in Parliament for a while longer or leave pretty soon. It doesn't have to factor. He can just go. Next plane for Santa Monica, guilt-free, says Lee Hallam. Indeed. So, yeah, this election might ultimately come as a bit of a relief for Sunak, I think. I mean, how long have we got left of it, guys? We've got less than 2 weeks to go. Polling day is not next Thursday, but the Thursday after. I feel like during that time, we might get one or two more gaffes or scandals, given the rate at which we've had them in this election so far. I don't think anything's really going to move the dial that much, though, to be honest. Like, I think the most significant event of this election campaign was Farage announcing that he was going to return to lead Reform and to be a Reform candidate, and then him putting that sort of rocket booster on Reform, namely, not entirely, but namely at the detriment of the Tories. As much as Sunak announcing it in the rain and missing D-Day, which I think might have harmed his chances amongst some wavering types, but or at least solidified to people why they're not voting for him. I think fundamentally, when you're looking at things that happened within the campaign that affected the outcome of the election the most, it will probably be Reform entering the race. Dr. Fox says, Lee Hallam says, Dr. Fox is angling for temporary leader, I hear. Tom Tugendhat seems to have declared more or less as a candidate for leader. Tugger, he's back. Now, I've heard differing things about where the Tory party, because this is another really big question following the election, where the Tory party ends up after all this. Let's assume they end up with 100 or so MPs left. Much reduced from where they are right now, and they need to make a decision in the wake of the election and the Labour supermajority and all the rest of it. Where does the Tory party go? Do we tack to the centre and try and win back some of our votes from Labour and win from the centre ground, or do we decide that we weren't Reform enough and we need to chase after those Reform voters who've abandoned us? Because chasing after the Reform vote has really gone so well for them in the past couple of years, hasn't it? But they may well decide to do that as well. I say they as if they're one big, amorphous blob making decisions. But it will end up being the MPs that are left nominating and then the party membership voting on someone. Now, my assumption would continue to be that the membership would vote for the most right-wing candidate available. But slight difference to that being, I wonder if maybe some of the Tory membership has peeled away and disappeared off to Reform at this point, taking with them some of their voting intention with them. But Lee Hallam says the study suggests there won't be a change in the balance of MPs depending on the level of seats. That's interesting, because I'd heard stuff on one side saying, it's going to favour like your One Nation Tories, and on the other side saying, no, it'll be your Bravermans and your Badenochs and all of them types. But you're saying from what you've heard that it remains roughly level, so it won't. So in the end, then the reasonable expectation is that you'll probably get put to the members. You'll get a One Nation type candidate and probably a candidate from the right of the party, and it'll be between them. But Lee also adds a lot of right-wing members have gone. I see. So my previous assumption would have been, oh, the membership will vote in the most right. Absolutely. Or just whoever kind of scratches that kind of itch of like, when it was Liz Truss versus Sunak, you could see coming from a mile off that the Tory members were going to vote for Liz Truss. So a lot of right-wing members have gone. It might be about which big beasts survive. Coraline says, I wonder if the Tories will ever be in government again if they are under 100 seats. With the Democratic changes over time, I wonder if within a decade their party no longer has any substantive base at all. It's a very interesting question. And it's hard to it's very hard to answer as well. The Tories have been around for a hell of a long time. And they've survived as long as they have because they've constantly changed with the times whenever they've needed to. So it's always felt long term like you don't want to bet against the Tories in the long run, even if they have a bad time for a certain period. That said, if you take an event like in the early 20th century, the Labour Party coming to replace the Liberal Party as the main rival to the Tories, and the Liberal Party or various versions of the Liberal Party having existed for a good couple hundred years before that also. It does show that these kinds of seismic events when it comes to big established parties in our country's politics can happen. So although sort of based on previous experience, I always think, the Tories will eventually swerve and pivot to end up where they need to be to win back support. It's not to say that there's any magical shield. There's not any like main character plot armor if this was a TV show or a film that's somehow protecting the Tories. They've got to do it themselves in order not to fall into irrelevancy. So what will happen between what's left of the Tory party and reform will be very, very interesting, depending who takes the reins of the Tories, because I hear some talking about some kind of a merger, bringing Farage back into the fold, Farage even leading the Tory party. Obviously, I don't think that would appeal necessarily to, say, your One Nation Tory types, if any of them were helming it. But then again, the other question ends up being that if the Tories end up well and truly squeezed between sort of a more centrist Labour Party and the real McCoy in reform of some of the policies they've been putting out recently, then they get a bit squeezed. They get very squeezed when it comes to try and win back more support. And then does reform become bigger than them? It's not impossible. It's not impossible. Lee says the right-wing vote will still be 40% in this election. That vote isn't going to Labour or the Lib Dems, and Labour will mess up sooner or later. It's down to what happens with the split. Yes, quite right. If you add up the Tory vote share and the Reform vote share and all the rest of it, they still make a pretty substantive block. Not quite a majority of voters in this election, but nonetheless, and Labour's support in this election, Labour have grown in support, of course, and I think they've taken on more willing Labour voters than they have pushed away in terms of your young people, your progressives, your left-wingers, your Muslims, etc. But a lot of what's being handed to Labour in this election is get rid of the Tories. It's time to get rid of the Tories. Who is the other party that could lead the country that isn't the Tories? Oh, look, it's Labour. And Labour seem pretty, pretty middle of the road, pretty moderate these days. Seems like a pretty safe bet with Labour if you're a person who generally isn't inclined to vote for Labour, or not unless it's like the new Labour Blairy type version. But straight away, I'll put it this way, if you like. Think about the 1997 majority that Blair got. And then in 2001, he more or less got the same result again. By and large, it was a similarly replicated result, and it was called the quiet landslide. And I think turnout dropped massively. And the general reading of that into what the public had to say was basically, yeah, they voted Labour in 97. They are content with their choice. There has been no great change in opinion about the choice that was made in the years previous. Labour is the government. People are happy with that. They can continue to be the government. in that amount of time, the Tories have not suddenly, become this really appealing alternative. It just kind of rode over for that election how it was before. 2005 was a different story, but 2005 was post Iraq, so there was an awful lot that went on there. But if I think about this Labour government that's incoming and this Labour supermajority that's incoming, and I imagine the next election 4 or 5 years down the line from now, I don't think we end up with a quiet majority. I don't think we end up with such an easily replicated Labour win, or at least that number of seats again, because I think it's going to be very easy for a large number of voters who last time round said, "Oh, well, look, I was voting this way or voting that way or whatever to get rid of the Tories." And now that the Tories are kind of, dead in a ditch somewhere and Labour have been in for half a decade, you go, okay, I'm now more inclined to vote towards the way that I want to vote. And you're going to get people peeling off. Probably the main opposition Labour's going to get to themselves is going to be coming from the left of them, given that they've moved to the centre as much as they have. So the likes of the Greens, I think to a lesser extent Galloway's Workers' Party, it'll be interesting to look, but I'm not expecting any sort of reform on the left type thing for him. I think the Greens stand to benefit the best there, maybe the Lib Dems as well. Let me read a few more of these here. There won't be a merger. There might be a pact over seats. They might stubbornly fight to the death. I mean, I'm excited about all prospects, especially the stubbornly fighting to the death stuff. In Canada, the old Conservative Party did keep fighting for a decade, losing support every time till they had to give up. Lee also adds, if one party can go from a majority to disaster in one election, then it can go the other way. There is no enthusiasm for Starmer. It's not at all like 1997. People loved Blair then. Yes. And indeed, yeah, learning the lesson of the 2019 election, going, wow, Boris, 80-seat majority, wow, he's going to be in power for a while, and then just all the change and churn since then. You're right. Even with what's being handed to Labour on a plate in this election, it's not wise to then instantly assume that means X amount of future elections of them still being in power. If I had to, and this is a really silly thing to do so far out because we've not even had this election, but if I was going to hazard a guess how the following election would go, I would say Labour stay in power, but with a greatly reduced majority. But, it's almost not even worth me saying that right now because there's so many potential things that come along and change. But yeah, so Labour's been handed this. And some of it's down to what they've done for themselves over the last few years and the direction Starmer's taken them in and appealing to those sort of middle ground voters and all the rest of it. However, a great amount of all this is down to the Tories absolutely destroying themselves and the public confidence in their party and their leaders. So Labour, come the next election, Labour will be rated on their own merits of have you been a good government for the past few years, rather than just, oh, look, Labour, all right, it's your turn. Had the Tories for 14 years now. It's time to give you a go. So I'm really looking forward to this general election night. I really am. And I think I mentioned to you guys already, but I have booked the day off work on the Friday following, which means that I can stay up all night and live stream the results, which is fantastic. Very much looking forward to it. And there's just so many. It is genuinely so hard to predict. I know I keep saying this over and over again, and yes, the headline prediction of Tories get smashed, Labour win. Okay, all right, then that much is sort of factored in at this point. But it's the minutiae of do the Lib Dems end up with 30 or 40 seats or 80 seats? Do the Greens capture 2 or 3 seats or only the one they've already got? Where do Reform end up? Do Reform end up with half a dozen seats, a dozen seats, a couple dozen seats? It's all of that is so difficult to tell at this point, because the national voting share polling only gets you so far, and as was mentioned earlier, the MRP polls have been variegated, shall we say. There's a lot of different predictions of different amounts of seats for these smaller parties across these MRPs. So the way it ultimately ends up is going to be really interesting to see. And where it sets the electoral landscape going forwards is going to be interesting as well, because suddenly You're going to have a bunch of new marginals in the country. You're going to have a whole new sway of different seat combinations where you're going to have Tory seats where the main challenger is Reform, maybe even Labour seats where the main challenger is Reform. You're going to have Tory Lib Dem challenging seats. You can have, well, I mean, the Lib Dems haven't been targeting Labour that much in this election. They've been really going after the Tories, but you'll probably end up with some places where Labour and the Lib Dems are fighting out just because of how many seats Labour are set to be taking. You're going to have seats that Reform will probably end up holding that you go, right, are the Tories the challenger to Reform here, or are Labour the challenger to Reform here? There's going to be a lot to unpick afterwards to kind of go, right, what's the new status quo here that we're operating off of? Right. A few more comments here. John Cooper says, hey, Swiss, is this a solo stream or will you have guests? For today, this one is just a solo stream. I'm not planning on going much longer than an hour or so. I just kind of wanted to give a little catch up and just talk about a few things. And typically, predictably enough, it started off with me kind of rounding up the news of the past week, and then it quickly descended into me just talking about polls and predicting the election, which is, you know, my favorite topic. Who would have guessed? Caroline says, I wonder if we are living through a similar seismic event. Their issue is that class no longer determines voting patterns, but age does. What I was trying to say is that under 100 seats probably guarantees 10 years of Labour at least. Therefore, within that decade, a huge number of Tory voters will have died, and a lot of Labour voters will have the votes they didn't before. Obviously, a lot of complex sociological factors can go into the age vote correlation, so we cannot be sure of anything, but it seems like a possibly very historic moment, in my opinion. The thing is, and I very much see where you're coming from with that analysis of the age vote breakdown, and no doubt probably we are seeing the effects of that to a degree here. When we looked at the polling earlier and we saw, oh, so-called young people, 18 to 25, over half of them are voting Labour. In order to be, as I've heard being put about, in order to be more likely to vote Tory these days, you need to be about like 70 years old or something like that. That seems to be like a very clear indication of this difference in this breakdown of age in voting attention right now. But the thing I'd also add to that as well is that things are prone to change as well in the future, not just in the predictable way of going, oh, okay, more young people become eligible to vote, more older people die off. But moods and voting patterns amongst people in different ages and generations can change as well. In theory, as some more middle-aged voters today come into their inheritances after older voters die off, and then they become somewhat more affluent and they end up with more assets to protect and more skin in the game as they might have had previously, does that then impact some of their voting considerations, and maybe they'll start to become a little bit more conservative in their outlook of economic policy and that kind of thing? Some people, perhaps. The other interesting perspective on it as well is if you look at a country like France, for example, Le Pen. Le Pen's really giving Macron a run for his money at the moment, and apparently quite a lot of support for her party is amongst the young in France. So although in our country right now, I think the general truism that we hear of, you know, older voters more conservative, younger voters more progressive, that's holding very much true here right now, and I think it will continue to be true for a little while. I don't think it's baked in forever. I don't think you could safely say it will always be the case that older people will vote Tory to that degree and younger people will vote Labour to that degree. And because of aging in and dying off, it will continue to mount in Labour's favour. I think that at this point in time, that's favouring Labour quite nicely right now, because the Tories do just seem to have a rump of maybe older voters or lifelong Tory voters who are just going to back them because, you know, who else? I always have. But I'm not convinced that sort of change in the way that you've described it is what's baked in for the future. But Caroline says, yes, this is one of those complex sociological factors. Who knows what young people who become more materially well off over time will do. And yeah, in European elections, a lot of the younger voters, or at least relatively, voted for right-wing parties. What I will say though is that I think, as far as the youth vote goes, one prediction that I will make is that over the course of the next parliament, you will see it moving away from Labour elsewhere. You'll probably see a greater degree of younger people going to vote Green, for example. You might even see Reform overtake the Tories amongst younger people as well. I think that's perfectly possible. But I can't say for sure where things end up at the moment, other than it is a very interesting set of considerations. Lee Hallam adds to this: age is the key factor now, but you can't be clear what future young people think. 5 years of a Labour government letting them down could make a big difference. Bill Tycoon adds, if you can't buy a house, you won't have much to conserve. The Conservatives has harmed themselves there. Cooper says, I think for the young French, it could be more anti-establishment, vote for the right. Lee Hallam says it's interesting that the biggest lovers in the European, biggest losers, I think you mean there, in the European elections were the Greens. That's right, the Green grouping in the EU Parliament. Coraline says, of course, this voting pattern has been the case for a few decades, but it didn't affect the Tories to the same existential level after 1997. Once more, purely anecdotal, as it always is with me relaying to you my lived experiences. My family, how have they indicated that they're likely to vote? My dad is not going to vote. He says he's not interested in any of them, which I think has maybe come as a slight relief for me that he's not voting rather than voting Reform, which I thought might be his second choice. He's an interesting one, my dad. He rarely votes in elections, but I think he voted in an election in the past few years for Corbyn's Labour. And yet he's of the sort of person politically that I could have imagined him also voting Reform as well. But he said, nah, thinks Nigel's a grifter. So my dad's not voting. My mum is voting Labour, although her personal politics probably sits, quite progressively to the left of Labour. I think she's much more naturally a Green or a pre-tuition fees Lib Dem. My younger siblings, I've got 2 brothers and a sister. None of them, I think, have out and out said to me, I'm voting Labour. Now, keep in mind, I'm 30, so my younger siblings range from being nearly 20 to their late 20s. None of them have out and out said I'm voting Labour, generally because they kind of go and twist their nose at the thought of Keir Starmer. One of them is flirting with the idea of voting for the Lib Dems, but isn't sure. Another one is likely to go for, I don't know, socialist coalition, trade, voice, union, workers, something. One of those ones. And the other one, I'm not sure at all, to be honest. But yeah. Leeble says, so basically your dad's a Putin apologist. Lol, mainstream media, right? I've got no further comments to make about my father and his politics. It's a complicated affair, to say the very least, but it's led to some very interesting and challenging debates and conversations. I'll say that much. What else have we got here? John Cooper says, have you seen the attack that the 3 main parties have done towards Farage for what he said recently about Putin? Yes. We started talking about that at the beginning of the stream today, saying that this sort of felt like the first bit of trouble Farage could be in this election campaign. Coraline says, I agree with the point you made about younger voters splitting after Labour wins a landslide. Lib Dems for sure will be a problem for Labour going forward. Coraline, by the way, have you been in the chat for many of these streams? Am I just noticing you for the first time, or is it a new name, or what have you? But I tend to recognise most familiar faces most of the time, and I feel like you're new, or at least I've not spoken to you much, but I'm enjoying your contributions, so thank you. ABM says, Papa Swiss interview at some point. I'm afraid that will never happen. My dad's an intensely private person who's got no interest in doing that kind of thing for internet people to listen to, I'm afraid. So occasionally you'll hear me relay some things to you secondhand, just as a bit of a flavour for what people around me are thinking. Sadly, you'll never get Papa Swiss on here. Although one of my brothers has expressed an interest in coming on, and he's quite he's quite good. He's quite sort of a politically fluent, and we have quite good conversations about things. He's pretty switched on. So I have thought it'd be interesting to have him on one time, but we'll see. Coraline says, I've been watching since 2017, but I haven't been in chat since the day Liz Truss resigned. You wished me a happy birthday. Oh, did I? I've got a memory like a sieve, and you do need to forgive me that when you think that I've been doing this YouTube channel since 2017 or so, being 7 odd years, the amount of things I forget. But in which case then, Coraline, thank you, long-term viewer of the channel, Coraline, for supporting me all this time and for popping up recently as well. And happy birthday for in a couple of months when we come up to the anniversary of Liz Truss resigning again. Lee Ball says, Ari the Nige stuff. Look, if a history exam asks how did World War II start, just write Hitler bad. You fail the exam. What? Sorry, let me start off again. Ari the Nige stuff. Look, if a history exam asks how did World War II start and you just write Hitler bad, you fail the exam. Similarly, Putin bad isn't everything about the current situation. Oh, right. Okay. Yes. No, I agree with that, Lee. I agree with what you're saying there. You would fail the exam if you just said Hitler bad. Hitler bad, man, mustache bad. You need to go into the conditions of it. You need to talk about what was happening in Germany at that time. You need to talk about the legacy of the First World War, all that sort of stuff. I absolutely agree there. But I think that it doesn't strike me as the view to come around to be seemingly apportioning more blame to the Western allies of the invaded country than the invading country itself, if we bring things back to Ukraine, Russia. So your dad has my dad has no social media, no online presence that I'm aware of. Coraline says, thanks, man. Rest in peace, angels. Yep, absolutely. Apology Lee says, voted Tory today in my Tory. What? Oh, Apollo. Voted Tory today in my Tory Lib Dem marginal. Nearly voted Reform, but what Farage said on Ukraine. Oh, so it has affected a potential wavering voter. I felt like, I felt like this was Farage's first real mark against him in this campaign. To be honest, looking forward to a change in government, though. I love it. I love it, Apollo. Voted Tory, but I'm looking forward to a change in government. I'm struck by the almost total absence of politics from friends on social media, says Lee Hallam. There is very little interest. Do you think then ties into the idea that this will be a lower turnout election? That as much as us anoraks are getting all excited about, historic polling and destruction of parties and will the smaller parties fare well and blah, blah, blah. Do you think by and large, general public is just, oh, Christ, I'm absolutely sick of the last few years. I'm sick of the Tories. I'm sick of politics in general. Vote for the other guys, get them in. That's it. That's as far as my participation in this election wants to go. I could see that. John says, what do you think about the possibility of the Lib Dems and Reform eventually becoming the two main parties by the 30s? Oh, goodness. I've got to admit, I've not really thought about that possibility up until you proposing it now. I think, based off of current information, Reform stand a better chance of becoming one of the main parties by the 2030s than the Lib Dems presently do. I think Labour are in a stronger position over the Lib Dems as the main party of the centre-left, as opposed to the Tories and Reform fighting out on the right. So I guess, in a nutshell, that's my answer then. I think there's a possibility, depending what happens with the Tories, that it could happen with Reform, but the Lib Dems aren't quite there yet, really. Liebel says, just mentioning other parts of the problem is not the same as saying Putin great, as so many screaming voices seem to think it does today. Hey, look, we're in the nuanced camp here. We shouldn't be saying Putin bad or Putin great. We should say Putin do bad things. Sorry, I'm just laughing at my own idiocy here. Apollo says, more was a vote for the opposition that isn't the Lib Dems, and I hate my Lib Dem candidate. Bill Tycoon says mid 2019 all over again. Speaking to John, well, I mean, it not obviously yes. 2019, you did see that weird point of convergence between the four parties in the polls, and we've seen that in a much lesser extent in this election actually. Lib Dems and Reform both been ticking up quite nicely for themselves, Tories and Labour on the slide. I think the thing that masks the Labour slide quite nicely is that the Tories seem to be sliding more or less relative to Labour, which means that Labour get to keep their tasty 20-point lead over the Tories, even if they might be down a couple points from where they were before. Lee says there aren't enough posh people for the Lib Dems to be one of the two main parties. Coraline says Reform's problem is that their support, I think, depends on how badly the country is doing. We have peaked in terms of how bad the country has been recently, and that gives Reform a lot of ammo. That is a good point. That populism generally is best fueled at the idea that things aren't working, and some established elements needs to be challenged because things aren't working. So in theory, if things start getting fixed, then you're right. Makes it a more difficult case for populism. Who knows if there's support? I suppose then in that case, certainly looking at Reform's perspective on things, it'll be interesting to see how Labour approaches immigration during their time in office, because immigration certainly seems to be Reform's new angle. So, you know, can you address pressures on that? If not, maybe Reform ends up pressuring you. Who knows what their support looks like if conditions in the country improve over time? Lee adds, that presumes things can't get worse. I love this. You know, we've got to keep our cynicism intact as well, guys. It's a bit like inflation. You know, when inflation comes down, but you have to remind people, hang on a minute, no. It doesn't mean that prices are getting cheaper. It just means that they're getting more expensive, but much slower than before. Maybe Labour take over from the Tories, and it doesn't mean that things are going to get better. It just means that they're going to get worse at a much slower rate than they have in the last few years. Bill Tycoon says any other leader would maintain a 20-point lead. John says he's watching Doctor Who now. Apollo says I was much closer to voting Labour than I ever would Lib Dem, says Apollo TD. And also adds deport will be the new education. Oh, and I will add to this that I'd been flirting with the idea already, but after watching that Question Time Leaders debate again, I feel that I'm just a couple little notches further along, considering voting Lib Dem in this election rather than Labour, as I initially thought I would. Very much based on the idea of, I know that Labour's going to win my seat, and they're going to win it by a better margin than they won it in 2019. So I don't need to vote Labour. Who could I vote for? Who would I be holding my nose the least to vote for in this election? It could be the Lib Dems. If I can forgive them for tuition fees 14 years on, how long should it be before I forgive them for trying to ignore the democratic mandate of leaving the European Union? Well, I suppose Joe Swinson getting replaced with Ed Davey as a start. And yet, and yet, funnily enough, I think who was it? I think it was Gary, somebody who commented on one of these streams the other day, who said something along those lines, saying, "I'm thinking of voting Lib Dem now, because but I wouldn't vote Lib Dem if I thought there was any chance of them forming a government. I'd vote Lib Dem as a little protest vote against Labour because I know that Labour's going to win already. But if it was going to be the Lib Dems are in office, I wouldn't vote for them then." And yeah, I can see that side of things as well. I'm not sure I'd necessarily want to vote for a Lib Dem government. I don't know. It's still to play for a little bit. Apollo says, "What's the difference between the Greens and the Lib Dems?" I think the Greens want to get rid of our nuclear weapons, whereas the Lib Dems don't. I think they're both NIMBYs. That's not really a difference then, I suppose, is it? The Greens probably have slightly more extravagant spending plans than the Lib Dems do. But yeah, you're right. You know, there's not massive gulfs between Labour and the Lib Dems. Labour and the Lib Dems, Greens and Lib Dems. I think actually though, when I was thinking about where my alternate vote could end up going if I didn't vote Labour this election, I had thought about the Greens, but it was things like their policy on the nuclear deterrent, for example, that made me go, no, I think that's going to be a red line for you guys. I'm afraid in this world that we're living in right now. I think I want the default position of any party that I vote for to be for the basic, national security orthodoxy of the country. I'm not especially as fussed quibbling about whether you're going to spend 2.5% in the next 5 years or 2.5% by the end of the next 5 years, or this, that, or the other. But there's certain things which it's a shame, because a lot of my more sort of left-wing economic leanings do brush up against the Greens quite nicely. But I don't know. So yeah, a week and a half out from the election, I think at the moment I'm still kind of I'm torn between Labour, the Lib Dems, and spoiling my ballot. That's kind of where I am with it right now. Right, a few more comments here. If you vote Lib Dem, you'll have to set your profile picture back to Tim Farron's milk. God, it would be an absolute betrayal of everything 2017 Swiss believed in. And to be fair, there's been a lot of betrayals of the things that 2017 Swiss believed in. Tuition fees last 30 plus years, says Apollo TD. Reform Party Liberal Democrat coalition in 2029 is my professional academic prediction. The Greens want there to be no economic growth. With the others, it's accidental. Apollo says, I nearly voted SDP, but my seat is marginal enough. Oh, now bring the SDP back into the race again. Then I'd be, I don't know. I don't know if I want the Social Democratic Reform Light Party or not, but I feel that they would turn my head about as much as the prospect of voting Lib Dem by it. Oh, well. But then again, you say it's a marginal. My considerations would be different if it was a marginal. If I was in, say, I don't know, a Labour versus Tory marginal seat, then I'd probably vote Labour in this election, because I'd only consider voting frivolously the way that I might want to vote, or the way that I least don't want to vote, if I know that the Tory candidate's going to be defeated. That's the main MO of my voting intention this year. However I vote, don't allow the Tories to get in. But if you're already in a pretty safe Labour seat, then you're probably fine. All right then, guys, let me see. So we have gone past the hour at this point. So I'm going to wrap up the stream soon enough. I will have some guests on again for some more streams in the future. And we do still have more of the manifestos to look at as well. We touched on the Lib Dem manifesto last time. We've got reforms, contracts with the people. And of course, we've got the Labour and Tory offerings. I think probably the way we'll do things is we'll do the Labour manifesto very last, because it seems appropriate enough to look at Labour plans closest to the election result itself, given that they are the plans that are actually, likely to be implemented in the next Parliament. Everything else is a bit of a curiosity. So I think next we'll do reforms, contracts with the people in a stream in the next few days, and then we'll do the Tories at some point as well. Don't ask me about the SNP and and the Greens as well. Well, if you're doing reform and the Lib Dems, you've got to include the Greens. God, now I know what it's like trying to run a debate TV show on one of the news channels. You include these guys, but you got to include the others, or it's not very fair. Finger wagging. All right then. Anyway, folks, I hope you guys enjoy yourselves. I don't know where you are today, but for me at the moment, it's absolutely lovely outside. So I might actually take advantage of that and go for a little walk while the sun's still out. It is the middle of the it was the summer solstice, wasn't it? Not long ago. Shortest night and longest day. I love this time of the year, and that's also reminded me of Stonehenge and the Druids, and then that's also reminded me of Just Stop Oil and spraying Stonehenge with all the paint. And I think as a sort of a mandatory intervention, I need to just say, oh yeah, they're a bunch of tits, aren't they? There we are. I've said my bit. Couple more. Apollo says, I paid for a Labour manifesto the other day to be delivered so I can have on paper when they lie over tax in a couple of years. Cost me £17, says Apollo. Starmer will not be bound by his manifesto after the election. Well, with a majority the size of it. Yeah, I mean the biggest thing that I've heard people say of Labour, and there's truth to it, isn't there? That as much as the Tories and Sunak's line that they were bringing out saying Labour will cost you £2,000 in tax, and that being their particular thing they were saying, and it all seeming a bit spurious and cobbled together, and oh well, how can you be so sure about that particular figure, and all the rest of it. The general idea of, okay, Labour getting after the election, they've ruled out these various forms of tax rises, and I feel it's likely, at least, at the very least in the early part of their time in power, that they won't rise those taxes. But what about other things? What about taxes on the periphery? What about these bans that have been frozen, that people are being fiscally dragged up into paying the higher thresholds and all the rest of it? That is stuff that they could play with at some point, because obviously you've got, even though Labour's not throwing out like a Jeremy Corbyn style manifesto in terms of the amount of stuff they want to spend and the plans they got for the country. The old line of well, the things we're going to do are going to be funded by growth. You've got growth and you've got efficiency savings, which are the two old go-tos of, we'll pay for it somehow. Don't ask me too many questions right now. It's for in the future. But it's kind of thought that Labour's either going to have to tax a fair bit more than they're currently saying they're going to tax, or there's going to have to be tightening on public spending. One of the two. So probably some sneaky little taxes in there somewhere, but I don't know who it'll affect. But here's the other thing as well, which is an interesting element to this. Although tax has been quite a big discussion within this election, and I would agree that if you're a political party, you should be totally honest about what your intentions are for taxing and all other policies. I think that there's kind of a mood. I don't know whether this has changed a bit since the pandemic, where you sort of had big state step in doing stuff and people became more receptive to the idea of that or not. But I don't think there's as large an opposition to the idea of, okay, tax me a little bit more and spend it on making the country better. I don't feel that there's such a great opposition to that as perhaps there was before. Again, I'm maybe not the target person to be thinking about this, because I've always been the sort to say, yeah, tax more and spend more. And I'm also one of those on an income that probably isn't going to be taxed that much anyway. But I don't think it's a great uniform opinion out there that says no, there can be no tax rises. Although that said, most often when you ask people what kind of taxes they want to rise and who should be the ones to pay for it, invariably they end up saying someone else. Tax. You can tax more, but just don't tax me. Apollo says Labour need to raise 20 billion more in tax than current just to avoid cuts. ABM says, woof, deliver. And Apollo says, just know that Labour spending won't go well. Streeting's team are floating more PFI contracts for hospitals. So look, see, this is why I rinse my hands in this election and I say, don't blame Captain Swiss. He voted Liberal Democrat in a seat that he knew Labour would win. So he's not to blame for any of it. Anyway, guys, I'm going to shoot. You guys take care and enjoy yourselves this weekend. Drop the stream a like if you've enjoyed it, as always, and I'll be back with more election happening sooner rather than later. There are less than 2 weeks to go, boys and girls. Keep watching those polls. I'll catch you later on.